We all know that the Nazis didn't win World War II, that they didn't invade the USA and turn it into a Nazi paradise. But that doesn't mean Hitler didn't plan it, and that Americans weren't afraid of it happening if they lost the war. So if Hitler had won in Europe, what were his plans for the USA? How would he beat them? And how right were those ordinary Americans to feel afraid of what would happen in their future? Before we really go into any more detail, we need to know what Hitler thought about the USA. After all, he was the main driver of everything the Nazis did. And his opinion took on an interesting change over time. During the 1920s, before he came to power, he saw the raw economic might of the USA as something a future Germany would have to contend with. He sees them as the kind of final boss of Germany, the ones they'll have to deal with once they've dealt with everybody else. But he doesn't see it as something he needs to worry about, because first, Germany needs to sort itself out. It's not ready to compete, yet. So he starts to dream about a little bit of land in Eastern Europe, and once they have that, they'll have the natural resources to be able to rival the Americans. One last land grab in the East that would create the self-sufficient basis both for domestic affluence and the platform necessary to prevail in the coming superpower competition with the United States. Eastern Europe is a place with food and oil galore, so you can see the appeal and his thinking in terms of rivaling a country like the USA that has so many natural resources. With all that land, they would be equivalent. But it is interesting that the USA figures in his thinking so prominently so early. I mean, he's not even in power yet, and he's already thinking about what to do with the USA. But when talking about Hitler's final boss, the USA, in this era he sees it more as a kind of economic rivalry. But he has a feeling that if Germany starts to rival the USA might do something militarily. So he has that in the back of his mind too. Also at the back of his mind is that Britain surely wants the USA to be weaker too. And therefore, Germany and Britain would be natural allies. Friends even. To be fair, once he got into power, he did get some mixed messages from the British. But we'll come back to that as the story unfolds. One of Hitler's most famous traits is his outright racism. And it's no great surprise that eventually it comes up in his thinking with the USA too. I mean, famously a very racist place, right? He did eventually model his racist laws on the Jim Crow South in the United States. But this specific racism is that he sees that the USA has picked the prime Nordic stock from all of the European countries and moved them all over to their country, leaving those European countries with the undesirables. And he thinks that having taken those pure Nordic people, the USA is going to be very hard to stop in the future. As you can't stop good Nordic people, right? That's his thinking anyway. The USA has such wonderful immigration laws, he thinks. But all this love for the USA doesn't last forever. The 1930s roll around and things start to change fast. The Great Depression started in 1929 in the USA and has spread all around the country and internationally too. The effects of it vary country to country, place to place. But Germany is hit particularly hard and chaos reigns. And this chaos leads Hitler to being able to take power. But that's not the only effect of the Depression we can look at here. It also caused a huge change in Hitler's perception of the USA and how strong it was. Maybe they aren't run by a super race, coming to believe that America was a racial mixture after all, a mixture that included Negroes and Jews. Such a mongrel society in which the scum naturally floated to the top could not construct a sound economy, create an indigenous culture, or establish a successful political system. I mean, I'm disappointed, but not surprised. And so he no longer sees the USA as a big mighty foe that's going to be hard to beat. In fact, he starts to think it'll be really easy to beat them, especially with the mighty German army at his disposal. There's at least one major problem though. The Atlantic Ocean. You can have the strongest army in the world, but if you can't cross between the two sides, then what good is it? So thinking has to start accelerating towards the logistics. How do you fight the USA? There's a reason it's a very hard place to invade. You need a very powerful navy to be able to move that many troops across from one continent to another. And at this point, Germany's isn't great, especially since World War I. So, he starts to accelerate investments in the Navy and the Luftwaffe, because good air support is going to be crucial to being able to cross that huge distance. Because if the other side can just bomb your ships out of existence, then it's not much good having a good Navy, is it? Now let's talk about the war itself and how things change quickly. Mike Tyson once said, "Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face." Now, it's somewhat lucky for us, especially people like me, that Mike Tyson was not around to tell him this at the time, because Hitler is about to get a series of punches to the face, and then we find out how good his plans are. But to begin with, things go well for Hitler. He pseudo-forces Austria to become part of Germany. I mean, he thinks it's how things should be, and so do quite a lot of the Austrians, to be fair. Then he invades Czechoslovakia. That starts to wake people up in Britain to how dangerous he might be. But at least one man in Britain was always against him: Winston Churchill. Hitler then invades Poland alongside the USSR. Then he invades several other European countries such as Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, France. Defeats them all. Now he's dealt with all that, Hitler can start focusing on his true goal, the USA. But even with all that land taken, Poland in Eastern Europe won't do on its own. He needs some of that land that the USSR is holding. But until now in the war, they've been his friends. They've been sending food and oil, basically anything Hitler wants, to keep him on side. But Hitler doesn't care about that. The communists are his natural enemy. And the USSR is up there with the USA as one of his biggest rivals. So, he declares war on the USSR and takes a lot of modern-day Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, Latvia, Lithuania, the lot. Guys, it's going so well. This is what Hitler must be telling the people. With all that land and resources at his disposal, now that the USSR is beaten, he can start thinking properly about the USA. That's going to be the next big challenge. He starts thinking out loud and says this to a German admiral: "America is pressing with its new imperialist spirit, sometimes into the European, sometimes into the Asian Lebensraum, living space. Regarded from our point of view, Russia threatens in the east, America in the west. From Japan's point of view, in the west Russia, in the east America. Therefore, he, Hitler, is of the opinion that we must jointly annihilate them. There are tasks in the lives of people that are hard. One cannot solve these tasks by closing oneself to them or by abandoning them until a future time. The Russian war has been won. If one must fight against the United States, then this should also occur under his, Hitler's, leadership. He finds the idea of postponing something that can be accomplished now cowardly. Every generation has the duty of relieving its children of that which can be done now." Earlier, I forgot to mention what happened with Britain during the war in Europe. So, Britain was helping France to defend the invasion against Germany. Famously goes really wrong. The British evacuate via Dunkirk. And despite the fact that Britain is now run by someone who has always hated him in Winston Churchill, he's convinced more than ever that Britain will come to his aid against the USA. But a year later, in August 1941, he says, "I will not live to see it, but I am happy for the German Volk that it will one day witness how Germany and England united will line up against America. Germany and England will know what one has to expect from the other, and we will then have found the proper ally." So he knows that Churchill won't change his mind, but he thinks that the English will eventually. I mean, it's a democracy, right? They might choose to get rid of him. But what about needing a navy then? If Britons can't be borrowed, what are Germany going to do? As well as continuing to build their own, they are also allied to Japan, who also have a fairly sizable navy, as we'll soon find out. And now 5 months after saying that he'd basically won in the USSR, Hitler is finding that his soldiers still haven't actually done the deed, which is a bit embarrassing. So the German army is camped just outside of Moscow. He thinks they're on the verge of sealing the deal. And on the 7th of December 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. the USA declares war on Japan. Japan is allied to Germany. So what does Hitler do? Until this point, he hasn't actually done what he needed to do first before he goes to war with the USA, which is defeat the USSR and take all of its land. And he thinks about what to do next for 4 days. Meanwhile, back in the USA, FDR wants to declare war on Germany. But the USA is highly divided. During the early years of the war, there have been a group of isolationists who do not want to go to war again with the rest of the world. They think it's not America's place to get involved in European matters. But the attack on Pearl Harbor has forced their hand, at least with Japan. But they're not willing to go the whole hog and declare war on Germany. But on the 11th of December, that problem is solved for them, because Hitler declares war on the USA. Now we look at this as one of the most stupid decisions that any leader has made in history. And it is an incredibly stupid decision. But you can kind of see how Hitler's logic is working, right? His opinion of the USA has got steadily worse over time. He thinks they're not as invincible as he used to think they were. And now he's got the idea that he might as well go to war with them, because maybe Japan's going to do really well with their navy and really upset the USA. So why not just try your luck and see what happens? I mean, again, in retrospect, this is a stupid decision, but we'll see what happens next. The USA declares war on Germany in response. The isolationists are now very quiet. Add to that, there's now very little chance that Churchill and Britain would ever sign a peace treaty with Nazi Germany, even out of desperation. They have another ally in the war. But Hitler's not too fussed. When he sees how the first few months of the war go for the USA, he thinks they're even weaker than he imagined. Their initial battles in the Pacific Ocean don't go well. Their initial campaigns in North Africa against the Nazis don't go well. So he feels vindicated that the USA aren't some big mighty foe that he's going to have trouble with. Let's see how that progresses. But there's still this thing in the back of your mind, right? That this is not the first war between Germany and the USA, so he should already know what the fighting quality of the US Army has been until this point, because in World War I, the USA joined Britain and France against Germany and had a not insignificant part in defeating Germany. So you would think that would play into the back of Hitler's mind, that this really advanced army had done really well against his own country not that long ago. And you could explain that he thinks that the German army's got so much better under him. May not be true, but Germany's army was very good in World War I in general, and managed to hold its own against bigger armies generally throughout the war. But I digress. The point here is that Hitler is not rational. We know this in retrospect, but it's especially clear here. So the conspiracy theory him and people like him believe is that instead of being beaten fair and square on the battlefield, Germany was stabbed in the back by Jewish people in Germany and the people that supported them. Obviously, this is a complete lie. There's never any proof of this, but it's something that's lived on for a long time since, because they just didn't want to admit that they lost. As we've already established, regardless of the quality of the US Army, if he doesn't have a navy that can cross the Atlantic, he can't beat the USA. He needs to start planning what's actually going to go down when he chooses to invade. I mean, he's still so close to beating the USSR. The USA is next. He can feel it. Also in 1941, Hitler says, "One day England will be obliged to make approaches to the continent, and it will be a German-British army that will chase the Americans from Iceland. I don't see much future for the Americans. In my view, it's a decayed country." A bit salty, Hitler. So if anything, his opinion of the USA is getting worse. And his first proper bit of planning on attacking the USA is to get the Luftwaffe to investigate long-range bombers. They come up with two options: upgrade existing plans, the FW-200s for instance, or start investing in a completely new project, the ME-264s. Either way, the plan will be to have something that can reach as far as Indiana and attack places like New York from either the coast of France or, if they can take them, the Azores. In 1942, this German map of South America is spread around by the British. It shows people in various places and lines drawn all across it. It's kind of like a network. What it's showing are spies spread all through South America. I mean, could there be an equivalent one from the USA? It could be spies, but in this case, this document is a complete forgery. The British just made it up to add to the tension of everything to do with the Nazis. So, what does Hitler have left? What are the extent of his plans? He has a conversation with the Japanese ambassador, who reports how one defeats the USA, he does not know yet. So he ain't got nothing, nada, lots of very vague plans. He never stood a chance. So no British Navy to help them invade. No real progress on bombers to attack the USA. Japan is struggling with the USA in the Pacific. Germany is struggling to beat the USSR. And this isn't specific to the USA planning on its own. This was a common recurrence in everything Hitler and the Nazis did. Their military intelligence was shocking. When it came to invading the USSR, they completely underestimated the size of that army, which cost them dearly in the long run. During the invasion of France in 1940, they almost botched the whole thing because Hitler became scared that there was a secret French force waiting to trap them. This wasn't true, but it almost cost them the invasion, which would have changed the trajectory of the war completely. All round, they weren't that good at planning, or much else to be honest. So that American soldier who was so worried about his hometown being overtaken by the Nazis, there was literally no chance it was ever going to happen. Even if he had one in Europe, which was highly unlikely, he never showed any aptitude to be able to plan that kind of operation. If Germany had succeeded, and then he had died, and then some other leader wanted to carry on his legacy, there's a possibility that some slightly more competent people could have started to plan something regarding invading the USA. But that's hypothetical. We don't want to deal with them. And just now, I mentioned their problems in Europe, especially the USSR. And it would be interesting if someone had a point of view on at what point the Germans actually lost the war, right? Because we've seen the USA entering, we've seen them struggling in the USSR. We haven't seen what happens later in the war. But what point did they truly lose it? Like, what point did it become highly unlikely that they could have come back from? It's earlier than you'd think, and this video gets into it.